Welcome to this third class on connective tissue biology. We're doing a series of histologic organization of connective tissue. And in this particular third session, we're going to look at organization and functions of adipose connective tissue. One unique thing about adipose connective tissue is that these are tissues which are predominantly formed by fat cells, and we're going to see how they look like. Perhaps before we start, I want to ask you a question that you need to reflect on. Two questions. Very easy though. The first question is, list areas in the body where fat tissue is abundant. So take a minute to reflect on that. Have an idea which areas in the body have a lot of fat, and just list them down either on paper or in your head, fine. The second question is related to that. In the second question, I want to think about the role of fat in those specific areas that you've listed. Why should we have fat in so and so area? For what purpose? Okay. I'm giving you a minute to reflect on those questions, then we proceed. Right, I believe you've done something. Now we can go on. Our learning objectives for this particular class are going to be mainly three. We are going to either describe or outline the following three things regarding adipose tissue. One, we'll talk about their key characteristics in general. We'll also talk about the key functions of adipose tissue. And we'll talk about the histological varieties of adipose tissues, and we'll look at how they appear on light microscopy. Let's begin with the first one, key characteristics of adipose tissue. The image in front of you shows you how adipose tissue looks like histologically. The cells you're seeing there are the ones we call the adipocytes. And we can see they vary in sizes. They're closely packed and very thin membranes, so to speak, separate adjacent cells. When you talk of adipose tissue, we're referring to tissues that have adipocytes as their primary cell type. Adipocytes are the fat-storing cells. And so the cells you're seeing here are the ones you're calling the adipocytes, the fat-storing cells. Such cells are known to store a lot of lipid droplets within them. Usually these lipid droplets are basically inclusions. They are cellular inclusions within the cytoplasm. From embryological point of view, or if you look at the origin of the fat cells is from undifferentiated mesenchymal stem cells embryologically. Well, we still have mesenchymal stem cells even postnatally, and so even those cells can still give rise to adipocytes even postnatally. The same stem cell also has capacity to perhaps give rise to fibroblasts, which form fibrous connective tissues that we've just talked about in the previous class. They also have capacity perhaps to form smooth muscles in some particular areas of the body. As with regard to adipose tissues, there are two types of adipose tissue, and this is because there are two types of adipocytes. We have what we call unilocular adipocytes, and therefore unilocular adipocytes will form unilocular adipose tissue. The image in front of you shows you example of such adipocytes. These are adipocytes that have one huge fat locule within them. So it's unilocular adipocyte. This other image also shows you a higher magnification of unilocular adipocytes. We have one huge locule of fat. Now, I want you to understand that these are histological preparations. And when we prepare slides histologically, there are some chemicals which are usually used in the process of staining of slides. Some of these chemicals have the capacity to dissolve and clear off fat. And so the slides I'm showing you, either this or the previous one, actually has the cells, the adipocytes actually have empty spaces within them, because the fat that was occupying that space has been dissolved and washed away by the chemicals used during the preparation of the slides. So these chemicals have the capacity to dissolve and clear off the fat within their locules, within their inclusions. And so when we fix such slides, those spaces that were occupied by fat will appear as empty spaces. And that's what we see in this image. It's also what we see in that image. And all in all, we're still able to pick that this was unilocular. The other type of adipocyte, and therefore the other type of adipose tissue, is the multilocular adipocytes, which form the multilocular adipose tissue. In multilocular adipose tissue, we have a single cell having multiple locules of fat within it. Look, for example, this particular image. So this is a single cell, but we can see multiple fat inclusions within the same cell. So we call that multilocular adipocyte, and it forms multilocular fat. Okay, we can now go to our second key agenda, which is basically the general functions of adipose tissue, and perhaps we'll stay more or longer in this particular section. One of the key functions of adipocytes or adipose tissue is energy homeostasis. Adipose tissue is able to store excess energy in form of triglycerides. Remember, these are lipids. It's important to note that the body has limited capacity to store energy in form of carbohydrate and proteins, partly because these two are osmotically active. And so if you store a lot of them within cell, they're likely to attract water, and that will be having adverse effects on the cells housing these particular inclusions. So they can only be stored to some extent, basically, like glycogen cannot be stored so much, and maybe not in all cells. But triglycerides, because they don't have water within them, they're not osmotically active so much to say. So the cells can actually store them quite a lot without adverse osmotic effects. Tailored to that, because the triglycerides lack water, their caloric density is usually quite high, almost twice that of proteins, and carbohydrates, even including glycogen. This is simply to say that triglycerides are able to concentrate more energy than proteins and carbohydrates. And so it's the most efficient way of storing energy in the human body. They offer a dynamic form of energy storage. This is to mean that it can be converted. When there is excess, we store. When there is need, it is broken down to supply the energy. And understand that our human body may not necessarily have constant supply of nutrients. Of course, there's a meal time, and there's a time that you can actually go for long without having taken a meal. So because of this undulating time of nutrient supply, the body has a mechanism of storing the energy so that it can ensure continuous delivery of energy despite the variation of nutrient supply from the environment. And so what adipose tissue will do is to store the energy when it is in excess. And when there is need, it will be broken down to provide the energy. They are very essential source of energy as well as water in situations of food deprivation, therefore. And just close to that, adipose tissue, when you break down triglycerides, they actually release water. It explains why some animals can actually live in deserts, like the camel can live in deserts and go for long duration without water, because the hump of that particular animal has a lot of fat, which when broken down, provide water to that particular animal. So anyway, the fat in our body, when broken down, give rise to energy and water. Second key function of adipose tissue is thermogenesis, basically generation of heat. In particular, brown adipose tissue is the one that is well known for this particular role. It doesn't mean that the white one cannot release heat. It does release, but large amounts of heat are released from the breakdown or the metabolism of brown adipose tissue. If you tailor this with the fact that this particular brown adipose tissue is also richly vascularized, it means that when this fat is broken down within brown adipose tissue and heat is released, this heat is transferred to the blood vessels that supply this particular adipose tissue. And with that, the blood that moves from this adipose tissue to the rest of the body would help in warming the body, and especially in situations where there is cold. This is particularly important in newborn babies who have a larger surface area to volume ratio. Therefore, they are at risk of losing a lot of heat and getting hypothermia. Therefore, brown adipose tissue is actually abundant in this particular age group for this particular purpose, where the body is able to generate heat to warm itself. Remember that this is not shivering. It's actually just metabolism of fat to give energy, heat energy, otherwise known as the non-shivering thermogenesis, very well displayed in newborn babies. Third key function of adipose tissue is on thermal insulation. In particular, the subcutaneous adipose tissue, otherwise known as panniculus adiposum. This is the adipose tissue beneath our skin. It protects the body against cold, basically by reducing the rate of heat loss from the environment. So the heat that our body has already accumulated we don't want to release it to the environment during cold weather. From a physics point of view, maybe it's important to note that the thermal conductivity of adipose tissue is maybe half less than that of skeletal muscles, to mean that adipose tissue do not conduct heat easily compared to skeletal muscles. Therefore, if we have heat within our body, and they're within skeletal muscles, for example, we don't want this heat to be released to the environment, to the atmosphere easily, and especially when it's cold. So the subcutaneous adipose is providing a barrier between the body tissue like skeletal musculature and the environment, therefore preventing heat loss. The amount of subcutaneous tissue vary, however, between body regions and between sex. Between body regions, you'll find that there's some specific areas of the body that have a lot of subcutaneous adipose tissue, like perhaps breast region, the buttocks, the anterior abdominal wall, the thighs, and the like. And then there's some regions that will have less adipose tissue. Think about those areas that have very minimal subcutaneous tissue. Maybe eyelids, maybe scrotum, maybe forehead. So very minimal adipose tissue. And some regions have huge volumes of adipose tissue. Between sexes, there's also variation. Ladies will tend to have more fat, also in the buttocks, maybe in the thighs, maybe in the breast compared to men. And this actually contributes to the body contour that ladies have, the characteristic body contour that ladies or females have compared to males. Fourth key function of adipose tissue is in cushioning function. Adipose tissue is preferentially located around some organs, such as the kidneys. They're surrounded by a lot of fat, intestines. The fat around the intestines basically attached in something called the mesentery and the omentum. Also, we have fat around the heart, maybe some organs as well. Now, in addition to that, we also have fat located in some specific regions like the palm of your hands, the sole of our feet, within bone marrow, within the sockets of the orbit, basically where the eye is found. And in all these areas, adipose tissue will provide cushioning to the organ or to these regions, basically. So for example, in the palms, cushioning, because we use our palms a lot in touching things. So we need some cushioning effect. On the sole, we walk with our feet, and so some cushioning effect. In bone marrow, so that the cells of the bone marrow are actually placed in their rightful places without necessarily falling off. In the orbital socket, so that the eye is positioned as anterior as possible without the eye drawing back, so that it lowers your visual field. It is interesting to note that the adipose tissue found in such regions, which are largely for cushioning, tend to remain relatively constant, even in situations of reduced caloric intake. This is not the first adipose tissue that will be recruited when we need to break down fat for energy. Perhaps this will be affected last, or among the last ones to be affected. So the adipose tissue in these particular regions are relatively stable. They are not as dynamic as the adipose tissue in the other places. For that reason, it will take time to break them down. However, in extreme cases, they'll definitely be diminished. And we've seen some situations of extreme starvation where someone's eyes are sunken because the fat is depleted and the like. So basically, in extreme situations, definitely this fat will be diminished. Fifth function of adipose tissue is the fact that adipocytes are able to produce some chemicals into the bloodstream, which act as hormones, or in the environment or in the neighborhood, which function as paracrine factors. In particular, we know of a hormone called leptin that is known to act as a circulating satiety factor. This particular hormone has a number of functions, but we can mention a few. It inhibits food intake, so basically making you feel like you don't want to eat. It also inhibits weight loss, generally speaking, and increases metabolism, among other functions that it may have in affecting or influencing metabolism of energy in the body. It has connections with the brain, some particularly in the brain, like the hypothalamus. It communicates with fat tissue itself. It may communicate with muscle and how muscle utilizes energy. So quite a lot of functions in metabolism. There are other hormones like angiotensinogen. We know that angiotensinogen is usually produced by the liver, and it's converted to angiotensin 1, which become converted to angiotensin 2, which is a potent vasoconstrictor in the body, raising blood pressure. Adipocytes produce angiotensinogen, and that means that we increase the available angiotensinogen, hence angiotensin 1, angiotensin 2. What's the implication of this? Clinically, if somebody is obese, so that means that we have a lot of adipocytes in this particular person, it is possible that we'll have increased levels of circulating angiotensinogen, hence increased levels of circulating angiotensin 1 and angiotensin 2. The implication is that this person may also tend to be hypertensive. And no wonder, therefore, we see people who are relatively obese may also be at high risk of being hypertensive. Adiponectin and resistin are also other hormones which are produced by the adipocytes. We can check the functions later. Now, we also know that adipocytes activate steroid hormones such as estrogen, testosterone, and glucocorticoids. Now, point to note is that adipocytes do not synthesize these hormones de novo. No, these hormones are just being activated by adipocytes because adipocytes have enzymes that can convert these steroids into their actual hormones, estrogen, testosterone, and glucocorticoid. And that means, therefore, that the circulating levels of these hormones would be higher in people who are relatively obese. It's important to note that adipocytes produce not just hormones, but also paracrine factors and cytokines, growth factors, which circulate in the body and may have particular key functions. But from a clinical point of view, it also means that if somebody has a lot of adipose volume, basically obesity, the levels of cytokines and growth factors which are circulating will be quite a lot in this particular person. And again, this also explains or partly explains some of the complications we see with people who are obese, because there are a lot of cytokines, there are a lot of growth factors circulating. And so the effect of these cytokines will actually may have clinical implications. So these are the key functions of adipose tissue. I want to just scan through some of the endocrine and paracrine factors which are produced by adipocytes. So you to just have a clue that they're actually really more than what I've just shown you. So for example, we can see a list here of several chemicals being produced by adipocytes. And on your right-hand side, you may appreciate some of the functions of these particular chemicals. For example, perhaps important to mention the insulin-like growth factor 1, which also come from adipocytes. This particular chemical factor stimulates proliferation of many cells and basically has similar effects like growth hormone. And that's why we call it insulin-like growth factor. It's a growth factor. It stimulates growth of cells, basically. So the more it is, the more there'll be growth, basically. You can have your own time to just scan through the list on your left and the functions on the right for each of the chemicals. Still more of them. I've already talked about leptin. Perhaps at this particular point, I would want to mention about the tumor necrosis factor, which is known to interfere with insulin receptors. And so it's also possible that it's responsible for the development of insulin resistance that we see in obesity. Great, so just take time to go through the lists on your left and specific functions on the right. This just tells you more about the chemicals produced by adipocytes. Maybe resistance also important to note that it usually increases insulin resistance, and therefore it's also linked to obesity. It's also linked to diabetes mellitus. The third key agenda of this particular lecture is to look at the histological varieties of adipose tissues. I've already mentioned that we have two types of adipose tissue, the unilocular adipose tissue and the multilocular adipose tissue. Unilocular adipose tissue is also known as the white adipose tissue. This tissue consists of very large cells which contain huge single locule of fat droplet. As we can see in this particular image, I've already explained to you that these are actually empty spaces because the fat that was occupying those spaces has already been washed away by the chemicals used in the histological preparation of these slides. However, we can still understand the story that it was just a single locule within that particular cell. The adipocytes of unilocular fat appear polyhedral, as we can see in this one. They may appear spherical or oval, and especially before the fat is removed away from them, they could actually be spherical or oval. Remember, once the fat has come out, there'll be some degree of collapsing that would also occur. And so they may take the shape of polyhedral. Also, if they are strongly squeezed, they'll also be taking the shape of polyhedral. But if they're not very squeezed, they'll just appear spherical or oval. This image also still shows you the unilocular adipocytes taking the polyhedral shape. The lipid inclusion that is found within unilocular fat is usually surrounded by a thin rim of cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm of these cells will be very thin. Perhaps in this particular one, we can say maybe that zone is actually the cytoplasm of this particular cell, because remember that the fat droplet has already been removed from here. There's an empty space, but this is where the cytoplasm was found for this particular adipocyte. In this particular one, we can see some rim of cytoplasm there and there. Perhaps that's what is remaining of the cytoplasm. Because the locule occupy a large space within the cytoplasm, so compressing the rest of the cytoplasm to a thin rim, very crescentric, and then it also flattens the nuclei, also in an eccentric position. So the nucleus is not usually at the center of the adipocyte. It's very eccentric and usually thinned out, flattened, because of this particular fat locule. After we've removed the adipose, maybe you may not appreciate that much because the fat that was causing the compression has already been eliminated. But we still see some degree of eccentric nuclear. Look at this, that's a nucleus. It's not at the center, that's a nucleus. That's a nucleus, that's a nucleus. It is not possible to see the nuclear of all the adipocyte in such a situation because it depends on where eccentric it was with respect to the plane of sectioning when you're preparing these particular slides. So some adipocytes will appear like they didn't have a nucleus. That does not mean that they actually didn't have it. It just means that the nucleus was not in the plane of sectioning when preparing these histological slides. Unilocular adipose tissue is the adipose tissue that is predominant in adults and generally will be responsible for about 15 to 20% of body weight in adults, generally speaking. So quite a volume. In ladies or in females, this may actually be more than in males. We had already mentioned some specific regions of the body that will have a lot of adipose tissue. So this image shows you still the unilocular adipose tissue. We see several fat cells conglomerating together. We can appreciate their shapes, that they're polyhedral or almost spherical or almost rounded. The image on your right is actually a special one where the type of chemicals used is not the one that will clear off fat. And so you can see the shape of the cells are actually almost rounded. And this we can also use to appreciate what I meant by eccentric flattened nucleus. You can see the nucleus there, it's eccentric and flattened. We can also appreciate that the cytoplasm is very thin. Like look at this one, look at that cytoplasm, very thin, forming a thin rim in the periphery of the cell. So in this particular one, the fat here is still present, and that's why you can see the cells, they are very full and having smooth contour, as opposed to these ones, which are almost taking the polyhedral shape because of the collapsing of the cells. But all in all, we appreciate the features that I've already told. How about multilocular adipose tissue? Multilocular adipose tissue is also known as brown adipose tissue. Brown adipose tissue consists of adipocytes, which are relatively smaller than the unilocular adipocytes. Overall, adipocytes are large cells. whether unilocular or multilocular. But the unilocular adipocytes are much larger than the multilocular adipocytes. So the multilocular adipocytes are smaller than their unilocular counterparts. Also to note of importance is that the fat droplets that the multilocular adipocytes contain are multiple within the same cell. So it's not one huge fat locule, no, but multiple single cell. And that's why we call it multilocular adipose tissue or multilocular adipocyte. The nuclei of these cells are also eccentric, just like the one for unilocular adipocytes, but these nuclei are not usually flattened. They'll appear rounded or ovoid, as we can see even in these particular images. Yes, they could be eccentric, but the nuclei are not flattened. So we can appreciate them here. They appear rounded or ovoid. Important to note is that these adipocytes contain several mitochondria within them. And this contributes to actually the appearance, the browning appearance. Also, the other thing that contributes to the browning appearance is basically the vascularity that this adipocyte or adipose tissue usually has. So a single cell will have numerous mitochondria within it, very many mitochondria, as we can see in that particular illustration, very typical of multilocular adipocytes. So they have less of the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but more mitochondria, because basically the breakdown of fat usually occur within this mitochondria. Now, the metabolism of brown fat generates large amounts of energy in form of heat. So basically thermogenesis, as I mentioned earlier, contributing to what I called the non-shivering thermogenesis, a very important form of thermogenesis in newborn babies, in younger children, and even in animals that do hibernate. These are very important form of thermogenesis. Think about an animal that has been hibernating for quite a while in a cold situation. When it needs to reactivate itself, the metabolism of brown adipose will provide energy for this particular, will provide heat energy for this particular animal and now come out from the hibernation. We note that brown adipose tissue is abundant in fetal and neonatal life and diminishes during the first decade of life. So we don't have much, as adults, we don't have much of this brown adipose tissue, but the younger ones do have large volumes of them. It is richly vascularized, and this also contributes to the browning appearance of this particular adipose tissue. You know, the white adipose tissue is whitish, yellowish, but the brown adipose tissue is actually brownish. For those who are not very good with color, maybe those ones don't mean a lot. And so we're okay with the unilocular and multilocular adipose. Anyway, multilocular adipose is richly vascularized. There are several blood vessels that come to this particular tissue. It's also richly innervated, and especially sympathetic innervation is the one that is known to stimulate this thermogenesis that occur in this particular tissue. The innervation here is also responsible for stimulating some chemical release from the adipose tissue, the chemicals we've already talked about. In particular, the neurotransmitter that is known to stimulate brown adipose significantly is norepinephrine, also called noradrenaline. This is released from the nerve terminals of sympathetic nerves. Brown adipose also has some connective tissue septa that divide the larger adipose into some lobules. So we don't see this much with the unilocular fat, although it can still happen, but we see it much with the multilocular fat. Maybe I show you an image to demonstrate that. So this is basically multilocular fat. We can see numerous cells with rounded nuclei as opposed to flattened nuclei. We see also that there's some connective tissue septa that separate the adipose into lobules. So this is one lobule, that's another lobule, and that's another lobule. Perhaps this and this are separate lobules because I can see a thin septum there as well. We don't see this much with the unilocular fat, but we see it a lot with the multilocular fat, that the overall fat is also divided into some gross lobules. This image to your right is to help you just appreciate the vascularity. These are blood vessels. You can see red blood cells within there. So brown fat is basically more vascularized, more innervated than unilocular fat. The innervation is to help in the activation of the tissue for non-shivering thermogenesis. The vascularity is to help in taking away heat energy from this tissue to the body, because that was the whole purpose, to create heat or to generate heat for the body. Great. So that is brown adipose tissue. And that brings me basically to the end of this particular lecture. In summary, we have said that the defining cells for adipose tissue are adipocytes. Adipocytes are large cells that store energy in the form of lipid droplets, mainly triglycerides. And so tissues that consist primarily of adipocytes will be called adipose tissue. We have two types of adipose tissue, the white, also known as unilocular adipose tissue, and the brown, also known as multilocular adipose tissue. Unilocular adipose tissue is the one that is abundant in adults and has multiple functions, including the insulation function we talked about, the cushioning function we talked about, and production of hormones like leptin, among others. However, the multilocular fat, which is also known as the brown fat, is predominant large in the fetal and neonatal life, and perhaps very young children. Its key role is in thermogenesis. So the cells within this particular tissue will have a lot of mitochondria. Remember that they are relatively smaller than the adipocytes of the unilocular fat, but they contain multiple locules of fat within. They are richly innervated, they are richly vascularized, they have a lot of mitochondria. However, they are not quite a lot, they are not abundant in adults. Great, so that is it. Thank you very much. Our fourth lecture on connective tissue biology will be on organization of cartilage tissues.